Okay, so thank you all once again for joining us today. I'm Tanya, the client success lead at ADRES. I'll start with a brief introduction to our company before we dive into the main content. ADRES is an international consultancy at the forefront of the biopharma industry. Our clients are startups and companies across the globe, including the US, EU, Asia, and of course, Israel. We specialize in regulatory affairs, QA, and CMC. Today, Roy Zaibel, our co-CEO and data integrity specialist, will lead us through to a presentation on data integrity in pharmaceutical development. The webinar will last about 50 minutes, followed by 10 minutes for Q&A session. After the session, you will receive the presentation. So thank you once again for being here. And now, Roy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Today, we're going to have the first session of a series of 4 sessions, all dealing with data integrity. Today's session is going to focus on the understanding what data integrity is and its importance, mainly in the eyes of the regulatory authorities. So on our agenda is first to understand what data integrity is, why is it critical for pharmaceutical development, what are the regulatory demands and expectations from data integrity, the data integrity principles, the term ALCOA that you might have heard, and if we have time, we'll look into other definitions, and eventually we'll have a Q&A time. Since this is introductory, I just want to say that you might encounter some ideas and issues that you're already familiar with, but the intention is to give first the fundamental understanding of what data integrity is, and in the following sessions, we'll get into a bit more complexities of dealing with data integrity. So first, let's start with what is data integrity. And I took this quotation from a recent guideline from March 23 by EMA's guideline on computerized systems and electronic data in clinical trials. I'll try during the session not to read too much, but the guidelines on data integrity are very important. So I will read a bit from the quotations that I brought, and I'll highlight the important aspects. So what is data integrity? Data integrity is achieved when data, irrespective of media, are collected, accessed, and maintained in a secure manner. Just to focus on irrespective of media, that means that either electronic data or paper-based data should adhere to the same data integrity principles. To fulfill the ALCOA++ principles, I'll go into the ALCOA principles later, so I'm skipping this for now. When needed and traceable is described in section 4.5 in order for the data to adequately support robust results and good decision-making throughout the data lifecycle. Assuring data integrity requires appropriate quality and risk management systems as described in section 4.6, including adherence to sound scientific principles and good documentation practices. So, of course, good documentation practices are relevant to data integrity. They're part of the data integrity concept. Data governance should address data ownership and responsibility throughout the data lifecycle and consider the design, operation, and monitoring of processes and systems to comply with the principles of data integrity, including control over intentional or unintentional changes to data. So this is important. We're not just asking the question whether the data is correct, but whether there are processes and systems designed to monitor and control the integrity of the data. Data governance systems should include staff training on the importance of data integrity, principles, and the creation of a working environment that enables visibility and actively encourages reporting of omissions and erroneous results. Here, I want to add that all relevant staff members need to be trained. This is why this training is important. They need to have an evidence for their training, and you need to understand that no one understands the processes of your activity as well as you do. So you need all the staff members to be part of the data integrity efforts and to realize their role in maintaining data integrity. So let's go to a simple definition of what data integrity is. We can say that ensuring the data is complete, consistent, and accurate throughout its life cycle. You can say that the data integrity signifies the extent to which the data is reliable. You need to be able to understand, to answer the question, how well can you trust the data? Are you sure that you have the whole truth and nothing but the truth? This is the meaning of data integrity. And the importance of data integrity is first that it's a regulatory demand. It's not just important as a process, but it is a demand. It is something that is examined. We will look a bit more into the regulatory demands and perspective on this in this presentation. And it is critical for startups in R&D or clinical stages to maintain trust with regulators and investors. Eventually, the data is what you create when you're in the development process of a new product. And if there are questions regarding the data or it seems to be compromised, it can lead to serious delays and additional heavy costs because you might find yourself need to repeat some of the steps of development, and you lose the reliability with the regulators and investors. So let's get a bit more into why data integrity is critical. So as I said, what you manufacture is data, and you can say that the data is your asset. If the data is not reliable, all of your efforts or some of your efforts will become worthless because at the end of the day, you are not left in your hands with the drugs that you manufacture. They expire or they are used. What you are left with is the data that you created. So you need to have it prepared for regulatory submissions. So this is the main focus. You can say that all the documents and all the data that will be submitted one day, and this could be 7 years from now, but one day they will be submitted. They will be looked with the regulators' examination for their data integrity and the way the data was generated throughout the lifetime of the development of the product lifetime. And for the investors, as we said before, they're not going to invest if the data is not reliable for both reasons. First, because they are aware of the regulatory hurdles that you will encounter. And second, because this is what they acquire. Your IP is based on the data that you have. If the data is compromised, then a lot of the activities will have to be repeated, and this will be an extra cost for the company. And this is something that investors will refrain from investing in. If we look at the FDA's perspective, this is from a presentation on data integrity in a new drug application. So this is directly from there. I think it's good to read what is said about it. Data provided in drug applications must be reliable and trustworthy. failure to uphold data integrity could cast doubt on all information submitted in the application. So it's not just the specific error that was discovered, but if the process seems shaky, then the whole data could be in doubt. Data integrity failures could be intentional versus unintentional actions. So even if it's unintentional, it is considered a data integrity failure, and both types of failures, intentional and unintentional, are considered CGMP violations. And let's look at what the demands are from the regulatory bodies. The regulators that deal with this issue are mainly the FDA, EMA, MHRA of England, and ICH, the WHO as well. And their focus is on ensuring complete and accurate data throughout drug development. I want to say that they all issued many guidelines. So there's a lot of written material about this subject, even directly from the regulators. And usually they align their demands. That means that usually the most updated guideline will have most of the information that you need, and will include everything that was already included in the previous guidelines, even if these are from other regulatory authorities. The FDA just issued this October a new guideline for clinical trials. And I find the MHRA guideline the easiest to follow. I would start with that if you want to start reading the guidelines. So that's the first one that I would read. They have clear definitions there. I added the links to the presentation. We'll see them later on. And you need to understand as well that the regulatory demands are relevant also to the data retention period. It is sometimes a long period, and throughout the data life cycle, which includes the data retention period, the data needs to adhere to data integrity principles. And let's look a bit more at one of the guidelines and how they explain their demands. This is from, again, the EMA's guideline from 2023. What are my company's responsibilities relating to data integrity for GMP activities contracted out to another company? And I wanted to show you this part because I know that many startups have their activities outsourced. In many cases, their manufacturing, and in almost all cases, the clinical stages. And that sometimes makes the sponsors, the startups themselves, feel that this issue doesn't have to do with them too much. So I wanted to show you what is said in EMA's guideline. Data integrity requirements should be incorporated into the company's contractor/vendor qualification assurance program and associated procedures. In addition to having their own data governance systems, companies outsourcing activities should verify the adequacy of comparable systems at the contract acceptor. The contract acceptor should apply equivalent levels of control to those applied by the contract giver. Formal assessment of the contract acceptor's competency and compliance in this regard should be conducted in the first instance prior to the approval of a contractor, and therefore verified and thereafter verified on a periodic basis at an appropriate frequency based on risk. So I can tell you about a case when one of our clients had to prepare their CDMO for BLA. And during the preparation, we found out that they were lacking source data for one of the analytical method validation. And they actually needed to repeat the validation itself. That caused, of course, extra costs and delays to the process. And I want to point out another thing, that it is said that the frequency should be based on risk, and basing your decisions on risk is a key element to data integrity maintenance. We will get more into this on our third webinar. And if we look again at the presentation of the FDA, they highlight the indicators for issues by their inspectors. These are indicators that data integrity is not being maintained in the facility as it should be. So, for example, failure to investigate adequately and document ORS or aberrant results, testing into compliance, failure to prevent unauthorized access or changes to data, lack of audit trails for lab instruments, and turning off audit trails. So I just want you to notice that the two first points are pretty obvious. You need to investigate adequately OS or aberrant results. You shouldn't test into compliance. You should record all the tests and have good justifications for them. But even failure to prevent unauthorized access, that means that your system allows unauthorized access, or changes to data, or you don't use audit trails appropriately. These alone are indicators for a concern about data integrity. We will get more into audit trails and their story on the next webinar, not today. There are a few more indicators. Failure to record activities at the time they were performed. We will see the Alcoa principles, it is mentioned there as well. And failure to have controls over electronic data. Electronic data is a big issue. When we talk about data integrity, we almost always talk about electronic data, because almost everyone uses electronic data for most of your processes today. And these data have some advantages to the fact that it's electronic, and some challenges to the fact that they're electronic. So we'll get more into that as well on our next webinar. These are the key data integrity guidelines by major regulatory bodies. I've added the two most updated that I know of, one of this October by the FDA, and one of 2023 by EMA. They are both focusing on clinical trials, so they might get into details that are irrelevant for companies that manufacture. But I still recommend that anyone looks at them, because they give a good explanation of the expectations from data integrity, and how to approach it, and some tools. And they even touch the issue of artificial intelligence in clinical trials. So this is something that I would recommend, especially if you're during a clinical investigation. I would recommend looking at those. Now, let's talk about the Alcoa principles. You can say that when you talk about data integrity, it means Alcoa. If you adhere to the Alcoa Plus, you can see Alcoa Plus Plus, but they're basically all the same. If you adhere to these principles, that means that you adhere to the data integrity principles. So you can say this is data integrity spelled out. And the spell out of the Alcoa acronym is first attributable. The data must reveal who performed the relevant action.
Roy,
Yes, please.
sorry, it's Tanya. We see a black. Um,
Let me try to share again, please.
okay. We can't see the text, so
Oh,
can you
sorry,
try
not
again?
this one. Just a sec. Tell me if it works now.
Okay. No, there is a just a minute. I will send you current screen.
You can't see the screen that I'm sharing? Let me try this.
Not all the screen.
Let me try this just for a second. I'll just open the presentation again. I apologize, everyone. It's because I accidentally pressed one of the links. Sec.
There is a small square, a black square in the right low side of the. Let's try. No, it's still there.
It's
Most
still
of the time,
there?
yes. Most of the time, it's not. Oh,
It's
here.
better now?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Great.
it was
You can
just
continue.
the toolbar. Okay, sorry everybody. Let's get back to the Alcoa principles. So I translated every part of it to a question that you can simply ask yourselves when you try to examine your data integrity adherence. So the first one, as I said, attributable must reveal who performed the relevant action. So when you look at the data, you must be able to answer the question, who generated the data? Legible must be easily accessed, read, and understood. What is the data? You need to understand what is written in the data all the time. This is very important, for example, in electronic records that sometimes are very hard to understand. So you need to have some procedure to explain how to read the data. Contemporaneous, it must be recorded at the time it was generated, gathered. When was it done? Original, it must include the data originally generated or lead to the originally generated data. That's called the source data, or you could be looking at a true copy. Does it lead to the origin? Accurate, it must be based exactly on the information that was originally collected, no estimation or generalization. I think that for scientists, this is the most obvious aspect of Alcoa. Is the data accurate? Is it exactly the data? And these are additions that you could say that in some aspect repeat what is already stated in the first ones, but still the regulatory bodies like to add them sometimes. A complete must include all relevant information, including repeats, errors, and reevaluation of results. Is all the data included? Consistent must be gathered using validated methods to ensure future data will meet the data integrity standards. Can we trust the process of generating the data? Enduring must be stored in a way that ensures its safety for the whole data retention period. Is the data safely stored and easily accessed, you can say? Which is also available, must be easily accessed and read on demand, or need demand or need raised by a relevant party or authority. Is the data easily accessed? So I see that the first part took a bit less than I thought, even with the disturbance that we had. So I will go into some definitions. In the next webinars, we will look into more definitions. But these are common terms that you will encounter when you discuss data integrity. Some of these terms I used already in this presentation. Let's start with CGXP record. These are, you can say, all the records that need to adhere to data integrity principles. And the definitions, I've taken them from some of them from the guidelines, mainly from the MHRA that I mentioned. Some I edited a bit in order to make them easier to follow. So CGXP record, when generated to satisfy a CGXP requirement, all data become a CGXP record. You must document or save the data at the time of performance to create a record in compliance with CGXP requirements. Processes should be designed so that the CGXP data required to be created and maintained cannot be modified. And this is very important because for R&D companies, still in the development of the product itself, it's very hard to decide how to approach R&D data that is still not GMP, but will be submitted if this specific product continues in its development. So we will discuss it a bit more in the next webinars, how to relate to R&D data. But you need to still keep in mind that all data submitted to the regulatory bodies need to adhere to the data integrity principles. Data lifecycle, all phases in the life of the data from generation and recording through processing, including analysis, transformation, or migration, use, data retention, archive, retrieval, and destruction. Data governance must be applied across the whole data lifecycle to provide assurance of data integrity. Data can be retained either in the original system, subject to suitable controls, or in an appropriate archive. Appropriate, again, if it allows you to access the data and read it with all of the context of the original data. And once I mention context, it brings us to the next definition of metadata. This is a long definition, I know, but I find it a good definition because it gives an example. So I will read it and add a bit if anything is needed. Metadata is the contextual information required to understand data. A data value is by itself meaningless without additional information about the data. Metadata is often described as data about the data. Metadata is structured information that describes, explains, or otherwise makes it easier to retrieve, use, or manage data. For example, the number 23 is meaningless without metadata, such as an indication of the unit milligrams. So up till now, the most important thing is to understand the data is data about the data, and it gives you the context, and without the metadata, even if it seems sometimes irrelevant, it should be really examined what metadata is needed in order to understand how the data should be interpreted and how it was generated as well. So for example, the analyst performing the test would be the metadata for that test. Among other things, metadata for a particular piece of data could include a date, timestamp for when the data was acquired, a user ID for the person who conducted the test or analyst that generated the data, the instrument ID used to acquire the data, audit trails. Again, we'll get into audit trails in the next session, but I can say now that audit trail is all about metadata. It gives you the complete context of how the data was generated, etc. Data should be maintained throughout the record's retention period with all associated metadata required to reconstruct the CGXP activity. The relationships between data and their metadata should be preserved in a secure and traceable manner. So it's very important. You can't just keep the results of the tests. It's just as important, the metadata. You can say that without the metadata, the results are meaningless. You can't use them in any way. Excuse me. And our last two definitions, original record. The first or source capture of data or information, for example, original paper record of manual observation or electronic raw data file from a computerized system, and also subsequent data required to fully reconstruct the conduct of the GXP activity. Original records can be static or dynamic. We'll get more into static and dynamic again in the next webinar. Information that is originally captured in a dynamic state should remain available in that state. And a true copy is a copy of an original recording of data that has been verified and certified to confirm it is an exact and complete copy. A true copy must preserve the entire content and meaning of the original record, including, in the case of a dynamic data, all essential metadata and the original record format as appropriate. And you can say that maintaining the original records is important because it can make the difference in case that there is any suspicion of data not being correct for some reason. It could be for an error or suspected error. If you have the original record in place and accessible, that means that you will just need to go back to them to compare the data that you're working with. If you don't have the original records in place, that means that you will have to repeat the test that you have doubts about. So it's very important, again, as I said, both for regulatory reasons and for investors' relations, and I would say for your business. This is what you do. This is what you're left with. And for now, I will stop for a minute just to look at the questions, should we have any. And if there are any relevant questions to the audience, I will share them and answer them. So please give me a minute to go over them. Okay, so I can see that we don't have any questions. I find it perhaps as a sign that everything was clear. I do think that this is, as I remind you, just an introductory presentation webinar. And on our next webinar, we'll get into more complicated issues. The next one will be the 21 CFR Part 11 mystery. And this will be our gate to the whole issue of computerized systems validation. Compatible but not compliant, how can it be? And the following one will deal with how to put in place data integrity principles in your operation. And in the last webinar, we will have a real world evidence discussion with one of our clients that had to go through interesting processes with regards to data integrity. And I want to thank everyone for listening. And if you have any questions on how to incorporate data integrity principles into your operation, you have my email address here. If you have any other questions that we can assist you with, please feel free to contact Tanya. You have her details in here as well. We will share with you the presentation. Please be patient, and the recording of this session as well. So stay in touch, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. The next session is in 2 weeks from now. Have a nice day and stay safe.